first question, so a topic of the day in this area at least is valuations, particularly on the consumer tech side. We're seeing Uber reach stratospheric prices, albeit for preferred valuations. So this is one of my pet peeves, that we don't talk about those the same way. But whoever wants to jump in, I'd be curious what you guys are seeing. I mean, many of you are US focused, some of you are broader. Are we seeing this just sort of, is it a bifurcation? Are things shooting out of the roof? How would you size up the valuation landscape? Gerd, you look ready to go, so I'm going to call on you.
Why do I look ready to go? Because I just started up the brains here. Well, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer to that question. When you look at different innovation trends or innovation themes, I think they come with totally different valuation ranges. Social media clearly has been way up there lately with some valuations which my math is not good enough to always justify it, but God bless the people who see that. So social media, maybe a lot of other consumer things, mobility, also cybersecurity is actually seeing very attractive valuations right now. I'm more the boring. Attractive
as in cheap, or attractive as from whose perspective?
Okay,
attractive?
Yeah, very good question, especially when you hear that from an investor. Attractive for the company, very high valuations. I'm more the clean tech guy, and clean tech is still a little bit in the doghouse. I think we've seen a hype a couple years ago where you said, I'm a clean tech company, and you commanded a 20% valuation premium. I think we've ridden down the hype curve, and now it's maturing. You also asked the question internationally. I would say in the US valuations tend to be a little higher than in Europe. But you put that in perspective of US companies, I would also claim an average raise more capital. So when you look at the resulting ownership structure, it might not be all that different. Maybe a last word on China. We've actually seen now that the IPO window is open again in China, we've seen a pickup in valuations there as well. Overall, I think it's a pretty attractive environment, just because capital markets are more receptive to innovation, to young companies, and we've seen a lot of successful IPOs in the US here. So I think it has been a good environment for venture capital, also when you think of the returns generated by those investments.
And over here.
No, I mean, just on Uber, I think it's kind of an interesting story. When Benchmark led the Series A, everybody's wondering, why would you invest at $49 million pre, right? When Google Ventures led it, the B at 3.5 billion, it's like crazy valuation. Nobody would ever invest at 3.5 billion, and now people say the same thing about the 18.2 billion. Anyway, I think it's, often it's in these later stage evaluations, it's winner takes it all markets, or winner takes almost all markets, and that kind of can justify a crazy valuation like that. I think overall, it's just where we see a lot of frothiness is in the early, in kind of the seed stage, angel stage area, where there's a lot of money coming out of successful IPOs and flowing back into the startup market, and probably not very valuation sensitive investors investing in these rounds.
Justin, that was teed up for you as a partner at Y Combinator. And what do you see in the early stage? And then maybe you can also talk about, I mean, I think of YC as very Silicon Valley focused, but I know you guys also have ambitions that are much broader than that too.
Yeah, so I actually think the valuations are slightly down from 2 years ago. They peaked in 2012 for a seed stage. But they're still really good. I mean, you're still, your first round coming out of YC oftentimes is better than the valuations Google and Facebook got for theirs, So I'd say they're still high and really attractive for entrepreneurs. And now is like a better time than ever to start a company.
Why did they go down? I mean, what happened in the past 2 years?
I mean, in 2012, people were raising a couple $1 million at uncapped notes. And I don't know, I think maybe there's just a little bit more, the angels who have kind of funded those giant rounds have maybe gotten a little more experience. But I actually think that another thing that was interesting to me was I was just in Europe and I came back, and the valuations over there are, keeping up. They're like less, but not as much less as they used to be, like 5 or 6 years ago. And with YC, one of the things we're really interested in is, I think a lot of the growth that's happening in the internet is going to happen internationally from here on out. There's a huge wealth creation happening all over the world, especially in Southeast Asia, and a lot of the money that's going to be made on the internet will happen in other countries outside the US. So I'm particularly interested in funding companies that are, abroad, and bringing them here to Silicon Valley for, boot camp to do YC, and then having them go back and create great companies where they're from.
Why not do boot camps where they are?
I think one of the things that happens is that there's an information asymmetry, and that's like the internet should be a great equalizer, right? So you could build a product that's usable by American companies and small businesses in Europe, and I see like all these people doing that now. But what there hasn't been as much of, ironically, is that like information transfer and like kind of access to contacts and connections that can help you get those like premium valuations or scale your company to hundreds of millions of users, and that exists in the Valley. What we have here is not any kind of infrastructure. It's really just, in fact, the Bay Area's infrastructure is terrible, right? Like what we have here is a network. And when people get plugged into the network, you can see them really accelerate. One of the companies that I love from our last batch is called Bellabit. And these guys we're a European company from Slovenia, and one of my co-founders from Justin TV, who works as a part-time partner at YC, Michael Seibel, found them at a conference, and we didn't find them, they like won the conference, and he talked to them and said, hey, you should think about doing YC, and they came here, were one of the stars of the batch, brought their product to market in America. It's like a prenatal heart rate monitor, and they raised $4.5 million coming out of YC and are doing amazing. And I think that access to kind of the Silicon Valley network infrastructure is really what helped them accelerate. And so I think that like instead of thinking about how do we bring YC itself, like program, to different countries, we think about how do we bring the founders here, and then they choose where they want to base their company afterwards. And yeah, the other thing I'd say, I know I'm kind of hogging the stage, but like we're doing a lot of startup schools around the world now. We're starting to do one we're doing one in London, our first international one in July, and we'll be doing a lot more events to try to bring, culture of entrepreneurship to as many places as we can. That sounds like we're doing it, but we're just like be involved in that, have a presence wherever we can.
And what percentage of the last few YC batches have been companies that, I don't know I would say maybe had ultimately headquarters outside the US, or because they're so early, so I don't know if they have a sort of geographical nexus yet, but some sense of international or non-US?
Yeah, we had 20% of our companies from the last batch had international founders, and I'm not sure, I think that represented 14 or 15 different countries, something around that. So it's a growing thing for us.
Kevin, from the AngelList perspective, so you guys, what are you seeing in terms of early stage geographic distribution on the platform, and how quickly is it changing? What are the trend lines going out?
Yeah, so right now about 20% of the companies come from outside the US.
It's interesting, 20%, that 1/5
right.
seems to be the magic number, right?
Yes, so it's been actually kind of strange for us because we just set up as a platform. We didn't go tell people to come, so various geographies just started taking to the platform. It started with the English-speaking countries and then has kind of spread to wherever there's a significant set of startups. So we actually set it up so you can go to angel.co/country name and you'll see all the startups and all the investors that invest in that country. And so whenever we visit a country, it's always fun to do that and see Germany or wherever else, all the activity that's going on there. And it's been pretty significant recently, and more of it has been trending international, especially in the last year or so.
Is it sort of an incremental thing, or I know these are big numbers, but are we going to expect it to be 23% in 2 years, or do you think that this is something else going on? I
honestly don't know, because it doesn't just kind of creep just because of what AngelList is, where it's for those of you who don't know, it's an online platform where there's pre-screened accredited investors and companies, and at this point there are about over 100,000 founder-claimed companies on there, about 30,000 investors. So it's making connections all across. Most of the investors on AngelList are founders themselves. So what happens is a community kind of pulls itself on. So you'll see nothing, and suddenly a few companies go on, they'll meet some US investors, they'll get financed, that will get in the news. Suddenly all the investors and all the companies are on the platform from that ecosystem. So it makes it very hard to predict, because we're not pushing it in any particular country. We're kind of following along after and seeing what's happening there.
To shift gears a little bit, I want to talk a bit about crowdfunding and the global landscape for that. It's something we talk a lot about in the U.S., lowering the bar to being able to invest in a company. I think it's something people are very on board on. You guys have been very supportive of. How is the picture in the U.S. right now different from what's going on globally, and what should this crowd sort of think about crowdfunding and what it's going to do for the landscape?
Yeah, so there are basically two forms of it. In the U.S., when the Jobs Act, which was a law that passed several years ago, changed a lot, especially for the securities laws that affected startups. When that passed, there were a set of things that got almost no coverage in the news that basically opened up the doors almost completely on what we call the accredited investor side, the sophisticated investors who cross a certain threshold of income or net worth. And that world has moved much faster in the US than almost anywhere else in the world. Online platforms and a lot of other innovations happening in that area. On the unaccredited investor side, kind of the general public, what most people mean by crowdfunding, the US has actually moved more slowly. We passed the law several years ago. It is still not regulated from the SEC, so it's still not legal in the US. They're working on that now. Other countries, like in the UK, Seedrs and Crowdcube and others are already out there trying it and are being regulated. It's allowed under the regulation there. So kind of the true crowd, so to speak, being able to crowdfund, that experiment is actually going on elsewhere, mostly in Europe.
What do you guys think about crowdfunding? I mean, I kind of go back and forth in terms of how much press and hype it gets first, but it also seems to be a massive trend, so.
Yeah, I mean, so a few thoughts. I think in general, the more money we can channel to entrepreneurs that make ideas happen and create jobs, the better. I think that the question is always a little bit how we do that, and I'm a little bit skeptical of equity crowdfunding. And when you look at startup financings and outcomes, it's just returns for investors are very unevenly distributed. And it's like the top 5 or 10% of all funds that make any returns, and the rest don't. So it's hard to believe that the person that invests $25,000 in a startup really going to create any return out of that, even if he does it over 10 years in a startup each year. So it's hard to believe that we're going to have a kind of sustainable ecosystem of equity crowdfunding over time. I think where I'm a big fan of is crowdfunding for other things like for perks, et cetera, kind of the Kickstarters and the Indiegogos of the world, where you get pre-sales against products or against perks, or you just want to support an idea. I think it's a very powerful tool to especially fund startups that are pre-VC, pre-revenue, and help them really get off the ground on a great product idea and a great support from a community.
I just wanted to add two thoughts to that. One is, I believe there's a bit of a momentum effect going on there. One really successful campaign probably prompts a couple dozen other campaigns. So when the momentum is on an upswing, you'll see a whole lot, and then maybe it tapers down a little bit over time. The other thing is a question, I'm not sure whether the answer is out yet, at least I haven't heard it yet, and that is, depending on what kind of a company you're trying to build, if you start out with crowdfunding and you maybe bring in 100 or 200 or even more investors at an early stage, and then you actually want to go down the path of a VC financing, you might run into some legal challenges like number of investors you have in there. How do you actually accomplish a shareholder consent when you have 300 or 500 investors out there? Silly things like that. So that's probably something for an entrepreneur to consider as you build the company, that you ask the question, what kind of a company is it? What kind of financing needs do I have, and what is the right strategy for me to pursue?
How do people get around that, Kevin? There's got to be a way, right?
Oh, yeah.
Individual
So I
shareholder.
completely agree with actually both of those points, and that's where I think more of the interesting activity in the US at least has been on the accredited crowdfunding side, because all of those, we have the flexibility to address all of those things. So for example, the In the case of the many investors, what happens in the US on AngelList is we actually do the accredited side through what's called AngelList syndicates, where there is a lead investor who is sophisticated, who is writing their own check. The rest of the investors don't go directly into the company. They go into a fund that is a single item on the cap table. So the company gets 2 investors, not 100. And then that lead investor is the one who will take a board seat or do many of the things that a VC or other institutional investor would do. Similar for the returns. What that does is allow the investors who follow now to do much smaller amounts of money across much broader swaths of companies so that you do get the distribution across the company, and you are only selecting among companies where sophisticated investors who have major track records are already investing. So you're selecting among those that have been pre-selected. So there's, those are just 2 of the mechanisms, but there's a lot of those things. More generally, I'm actually kind of a fan of what is going on in the US, where they are allowing that freedom with the more sophisticated investors to figure out a lot of these mechanisms, so that if we ever do open it up more broadly, that a lot of these issues have been solved along the way.
So let's talk a little bit about the markets that are important for early stage companies in terms of getting customers. So I think there's we're seeing a ton of companies come to the US market, right, from overseas. And some of that seems to be the customers here, some of it seems to be the PR here and the sort of buzz. What do you guys see in terms of portfolio companies or companies you're involved in that aren't based in the US? What are the key markets as they look to grow, and where does the US stack up, and what are the challenges and opportunities of coming here?
I think the reason people come here is because we have like 300 million people that are all like homogenous, basically, and they speak the same language, and they have the same spending profile. Even though there's very unequal distribution of wealth, they roughly have the same spending profile, at least the bottom 99%. And so, you know, it's a big market, unlike, you know, Europe, where there's many different languages in different countries. You can kind of build one product, and if it works in one place, it'll just like work across the US, hopefully. But I actually think the most interesting markets are the growth ones, where there's like more of a middle class wealth creation going on. Lots of places where people are first getting their, you know, their first computing device. So Indonesia, I was just there, so it's in my mind. But it's a place where many people are first getting their, you know, they're getting a cell phone, a smartphone for the first time, and these were people who are previously like unbanked. They didn't, you know, they don't have, their spending power is relatively low, but it's pretty obvious to me that they will start making more and more money over time. And like, if you want to be a billionaire, that's where I would like go and create a company, an internet company there, or maybe India, or I'm not too sure about Africa, but I think parts of Africa. Because not only are you riding the tide of like the internet, but you're also riding the tide of like wealth creation. And that's, you know, that's pretty interesting to me.
Do you think, I mean, this also sounds pretty hard to do. I mean, what advice would you give people, or what are maybe some examples of companies you've seen who are doing that really well?
Yeah, so I think you can look at China as an example. It's a little bit different because it's, you know, there's a lot more protectionism. But there have been many billion-dollar internet companies created in China, and a lot of them aren't even that innovative. Well, they are starting to be innovative, but at first they start off by just creating something that's worked somewhere else. So companies like 58.com, you know, people haven't really heard of, but there's like, you know, Craigslist of China. It's like $1 billion company, or there's a Justin TV competitor, actually. That's a public company that's, you know, multi-billion-dollar company now. So, you know, there's a lot of local, I would say, local products that will, you know, I think there are 2 types of companies: global network effect companies like Facebook or Google, where one company will really dominate the entire world, and more local companies, you know, e-commerce companies, local listing sites, and those companies will be created in every geographic region by someone who's local. That's kind of what I would look for, I think.
But I think it's fair to say that overall, I think Western companies had a really tough time in Asia. I mean, there's very rare examples, very few examples of US companies succeeding in Asia and with a standalone product, right? So I think it's tough to really expand something that just happens on its own. I think on these social platforms, one of my portfolio companies is called it's Wattpad. It's a social reading platform, and they have become huge in Indonesia. It's just got taken over, and it's now their kind of de facto way how people connect with authors and writers and read stories on mobile devices. But that wasn't really part of a thought-out strategy. It just happened overnight, and I think that this is kind of how some of these social platforms can scale in Asia. But kind of a dedicated approach to growing in Asia, it's tough.
If you want to do it, you have to go move there, I think, go live there,
We've noticed some different patterns in how entrepreneurs approach the market opportunity, depending on how big the local market actually is. So the US and China, for example, are markets, they are so huge that you can actually build quite a successful company just in your local market. So it's like, how do I penetrate my own market? And then internationalization, globalization comes as an afterthought to that. On the other end of the scale, you go to countries like Israel, for example, great technology, but the home market is tiny. So they start the company by thinking of how can I build a global business, and what do I have to do? And then there's a range of companies in between which are kind of too big and too small at the same time. And I would put several of the European companies in that category, where you have a sizable home market so you can get started there, but it limits your growth. And those companies sometimes have a little bit of a hard time figuring out when is the right time to go international. How do you do that? Do you actually shift headquarters out of your home country and go, for example, to the US? Or what's the right regional structure?
I never thought of it that way, but it makes a lot of sense. Too big or too small. Okay, one more question for me, and then I think we will open it up and keep this going. So please do think of your questions. Turning to the M&A side and the appetite for acquisitions, obviously the big tech companies have enough cash to do whatever they want with and are buying at big prices. I've actually been surprised at the lack of US companies buying foreign companies with foreign cash. There are some prominent examples. Everyone brings up Skype and Microsoft, but they've been complaining about their foreign cash overseas and that they can't bring back and they can't do anything with it. We also are seeing a growing number of companies, awesome companies being built outside the US. So what do you guys see in the M&A market for, I guess, specifically sort of buying in different geographies, and what's your take on what's happening and what we might expect in the future?
Yeah, I think the biggest problem is there's not much to buy abroad. I mean, when you look at Europe, at internet companies that have really scaled, it's probably dozens. And so there's just a very small market. When you talk about acqui-hires, you acquire a company for tech talent, it's hard to kind of have them over in Europe and not join the major team, development team here in North America. I think what's going to be interesting, I think how people think around, US companies going to think around the China opportunity, Asian opportunity. We haven't really seen a lot of acquisitions there. I mean, a few smaller ones. But if I was one of the big internet companies, I would definitely think very hard about M&A in China, if possible around regulatory concerns, et cetera. But that seems to be kind of the biggest opportunity.
Companies have tried that in the past, right? eBay or some others, and hasn't gone so well, right?
Yeah, I mean, Amazon bought very, very early Jojo, and it hasn't really done very well. Yeah, I mean, that's the big risk. On the other hand, Yahoo has done fantastically well in Japan and other areas.
I would say if we look a little bit beyond internet or social media, there's actually quite a high level of M&A activity globally. Now, cross-border M&A is tricky. A lot of M&A transactions ultimately fail because integration doesn't work out between the two companies. And when you do that cross-border, it's like an intercultural marriage, so it makes it even more complicated to sort things out. The other thing is, it's maybe not the most popular topic, but it's a real issue also with a lot of cross-border M&A. You actually see politics getting involved. And there's actual examples out of Europe right now where you see that, and we'll see what the final outcome is.
Okay, let's open it to you guys and just keep going. What's on your mind for the panelists? So the question is more detail about the politics being involved in cross-border M&A.
So I'll just give you one example, which has been across the media quite a bit lately, with GE pursuing at least parts of Alstom, and then the French government stepping in there and saying, well, this is of national interest, or potentially even national security, and making certain requirements as a condition for closing that transaction, also encouraging other bidders to jump in there. So politics sometimes want to have a say in how industry consolidation happens, because there's national interest at stake.
I'll just repeat quickly. The question is about the perception that VCs in Europe and outside the US are more risk averse, and what that means and what folks are seeing.
And I think it's really important to make the differentiation between the Valley and every other ecosystem out there, right? It's not, I mean, I hear that in Canada, you hear that in New York, you hear it in Austin, you hear it in Germany. It is, the power of the Valley is that it has created this really powerful network over time, where you can easily find companies, scale companies, sell companies, take them public, create returns for the investors, and then kind of you start this virtual cycle of better returns, more risk, better companies, more entrepreneurs, et cetera. You just don't have that in any other ecosystem, right? So the result is just, as you have bad exits and bad returns, then investors get more risk averse, they invest in less ambitious startups, and kind of you have this cycle in the other direction, right? So I think it's really important to understand that the Valley is a very unique ecosystem, and every other ecosystem around it, if in the US or abroad, has very different economics and takes on investors.
Yeah, I can add to that, because we run into this a lot when we talk to people in other ecosystems, and my perception is that this idea that other people don't take the same risks, I think it comes down to the fact that what people think of as risk in the Valley is different. Meaning it's the flip side of there being a lot less friction in the Valley to invest in a brand new team. Whereas I see in other ecosystems, people they didn't already work together. So I can't just give them a check and trust that they're not going to take it away to the Bahamas. Whereas a lot of what happens here with this ecosystem and the connections here is it's not more risk that I'm taking, it's lower friction for the same risk. So I can write a check. I mean, you hear stories here that I would never hear anywhere else, where I absolutely love what that guy's doing, so I left a $50,000 check on his table and said, send me the paperwork later. Like, that happens here, but it's not a risk. And it is a risk somewhere else. And so that's I think we lost them all. It is a risk somewhere else, and so that is what I see a lot more than that other places won't take risks. It's that what is a risk is a different thing.
We can hear no one.
I think the question is just more about YC's plans internationally, including partnerships and startup schools.
So we're doing our first startup school abroad in London in July, I think July 26th. And we're doing our same startup school in Silicon Valley in October. We're doing one in New York this month in a couple weeks. Our goal is to continue doing more. London's kind of like putting our foot in the water, but we want to do more. I think we're talking about Berlin and somewhere in Asia next year. So we want to, that's one big part of it. Another thing is that a lot of the partners are starting to travel more during the off time. The YC is not in session. So we run two programs that are between January and March, and then June and August. And during the breaks, you'll see me and some of my other partners travel more and go to attend like more regional events and encourage people to apply to YC. Because one of the things that was kind of shocking to me was when I went abroad was recently was people wanted to apply to YC, but they thought they weren't good enough. And I saw some of the best companies that I'd seen in a while in at a conference I just went to in Croatia. I think there's a lot of talent all over the world, like especially Eastern Europe, and I was like, wow, these guys. I encouraged them to apply to YC because I think that they, really had what it takes, and they were like, oh, that's a kind of a dream. So I think a lot of people don't even know that they can do it. And what we find is that when we go to an area and we fund one or two companies and they're successful from that area, we start to see like a flood of applications coming from that area, and that's really encouraging to me. So I think that's pretty much our plan. It's not necessarily anything formal, but it's a lot more outreach, and we're going to be starting that right now.
I'm going to butt in with one more, and then we'll keep going. So maybe down the line or in any order, which country are you paying most attention to in terms of entrepreneurship? Or pick one of the ones that you think maybe not getting a ton of attention, but really interesting stuff going on. I thought of this when you mentioned Croatia. Actually, the first version of our website was built by a freelance developer in Croatia, so big fan of that.
I would say the one that people really underestimate is Eastern Europe for two reasons. One, because you have a lot of interesting young people who are targeting great stuff, and it has characteristics closer to Israel, where their local market is not big enough, so they're targeting the world. And at the same time, for whatever reason, and I don't know why, that ecosystem is more plugged into the US venture ecosystem than to the European venture ecosystem. So you get a lot of interesting stuff coming from Eastern Europe these days, I think.
Well, being based here, I'm a little bit biased, but let me mention two areas. One kind of connects to the theme we had right now. We've seen lately a couple interesting opportunities also out of Southern Europe, whether it was Spain or Italy. There's some good entrepreneurial talent there. The ecosystem around venture-funded companies might be a little weak, so that's something that needs to be addressed. An area I actually like going to and scouting for opportunities is Canada. And some people say Canada is just another US state. I don't think so. It's quite a different culture up there, different mentalities, and also the way the country operates, I think, promotes a little bit different thinking in the entrepreneurs. And valuations, to kind of close the loop to the very first question here, tend to be much more attractive up in Canada. There's a couple other legal requirements than here, though, so you have to consider that.
As a Canadian, Boris, what do you think about that?
Love Canada. But we invest across North America, and I think Canada has a lot of great things going for itself, especially kind of Toronto Waterloo is a very, very strong area. But when I think about one country I would focus on is China. I think we're going to see dozens of billion-dollar companies coming out of China. I mean, yeah, I agree with all of these regions. I think there's all interesting talent and interesting companies, but the only country that will rival the US at some stage for dominance in the internet sector could be China, right? And we've seen tremendous amount of innovation of companies, and a lot of those only, Alibaba, for example, I mean, now got all of the press attention with the IPO, but this has been a company that has been built over the last decade, and not a lot of people really watched it here. So I think it's going to be fantastic what's coming out of China.
For me, I think Southeast Asia is where I'm most interested. I think there's like a lot of growth happening in Southeast Asia, and like Indonesia, but like Singapore, Thailand, the whole region is really interesting. So that's sorry. If I was less comfortable, I would go move there and start an internet company, and I think that's like my best shot at making being a billionaire in 10 years.
Great. Maybe time for two more questions. The question was whether the HBO series Silicon Valley reflects our daily lives and the culture of entrepreneurship.
I thought it was very accurate, actually, and pretty funny. I mean, it's like a great show, hilarious. But in the first scene, first episode, there's a scene where the doctor, he has a panic attack, and then the doctor is like pitching him an app to like help him with his panic attacks, and that the day after we watched it, we ordered lunch from delivery service, and the delivery guy came and was pitching us his app. So I was like, oh, I thought it was funny.
Well, I have to pass on that one. I cut the cables 3 or 4 years ago. So.
I will say my favorite little bit, for those who watched it, the bike meetings where the pods of bikes, I've actually Amazoned to see if that item exists. A good way to get some exercise. But anyway, okay, one more from the crowd, and then I think.
Crowdsourcing, come on.
Okay.
Surely there's one more question.
Otherwise, it's coming from me. So better you guys. See, I knew that would shoot hands up. Okay. Great. Question about South America and if anything's coming out of there.
Yeah, I'm starting to see some interesting stuff from a couple places. One is Chile is making a big push to be a place in South America where entrepreneurs come, even if they're targeting other places in South America. And I do see them collecting up an interesting group of entrepreneurs in Chile. The other, of course, everybody will mention Brazil just because the market is, it's kind of to the thesis about a growing market along with a growing set of entrepreneurs, and Brazil fits that. So those are the two areas that seem to be most active in South America.
Wonderful. Well, my takeaway is buying some plane tickets and getting out there to see all this stuff. So thank you guys very much. I think we learned a lot.